Have you ever wondered how hot the mascots at Walt Disney World must get in the humid Floridian air? Or how they can dance around and wave without ever seeming hot or tired? I never really paid too much mind to it. I've always wanted to believe that it was just the Disney magic that kept those poor people in those burning costumes in good spirit. But like most things, it's just not that simple. It was the summer of 2006. I was 14 at the time. I took a well-deserved vacation down to my family down in Florida to have a magical vacation at the happiest place on earth. Along with my mom, my sister, and of course, me. And there was also my Uncle Rick. He lives in Florida, so it wasn't really uncommon for him to accompany us down on our trips to Disney World. We visited Disneyland often because it was only about a 5-hour drive from our home in Phoenix, Arizona. So, as you can imagine, it was always a big treat for us just to be able to fly down to Florida. Me, my mom, my sister were huge Disney fans, and when I say huge, I mean huge. We honestly lived in Disney memorabilia. It was all over our home. We would see Disney movies on opening night and day. Anything Disney, we've done it. Hell, we watched, like, The Lion King a bajillion times in theaters. Every time they re-release it, we watch it. We don't even care. That's one of the reasons why the story is a little painful to tell, along with many others. My Uncle Rick, on the other hand, wasn't really a big Disney buff. He was quite the opposite, in fact. He was a very religious man, always rambling on about his stories about the good old days when he was a teacher at a Sunday school. Uncle Rick was significantly older than my mother. They were about 12 years apart, I think. As for me, I was never really the religious type, and even as a kid, I couldn't say I ever held any delusions of religion, nor am I really now. But that did not affect my relationship with my Uncle Rick. He was a great man, always happy, funny, and he always had something about him that made everyone who knew him smile when you brought him up. I couldn't have asked for a better man to be my mother's brother. My Uncle Rick also had his dislikes about Disney World. His dislikes consisted of the unnatural happiness of the people there, the crowds, the loud noises, the rides. I don't know how he couldn't have loved the Pirates of the Caribbean either. And especially the way in those mascots' costumes had to stand around for extended periods of time in the blazing heat, just so the people could take pictures with them. I tried to explain to him that it was simply their job and that they weren't in any danger. Hell, for all we know, they might have an air conditioning unit in there. But he would always find a way to counter my argument. Oh, and his likes consisted of turkey legs, even though he would still complain about how they were overpriced. He never seemed pleased when he was at Disney World, and it was obvious the only reason why I was there is because he wanted to spend time with us. And this particular trip to Disney World was different, however. Everything was fine and dandy up until the point where he pulled up into the Walt Disney World gate that greets you at the entrance of the Disney property. I noticed he had an uneasy look on his face as we passed under it, and then he got unusually quiet until we had already parked and left the car. Instead of talking about the usual stories of the good old days, begun to talk about a much darker subject, hell. It took me off guard, considering that he never really brings up the uneasy conversations of such unhappy places. And I'm not gonna lie, I did feel incredibly uncomfortable. Just looking at him as he was talking about the suffering that goes on there and how he hopes to never have to experience anything like that was weird. Then my mom, when she overheard his ramblings, abruptly ordered him to cut it out and just be happy that you're there. I had never heard my Uncle Rick talk like that. He'd always been so joyful. I could tell from the tone in his voice that he was genuinely concerned, but I couldn't figure out what had exactly gotten into him that made him upset. I also couldn't get what he said out of my head. I don't want you to ever experience suffering like that. Didn't know what he meant. He seemed very unlike himself. He was sad, not frustrated, not annoyed, just sad. I kept asking him what was wrong, but he would just look the other way and ignore me. We had been into Magic Kingdom Park for about maybe an hour, hour and a half, though I wasn't able to enjoy any of it as I was concerned for my Uncle Rick the entire time. We had gone on a few rides. Uncle Rick usually tends to go on to rides with us, even though he doesn't exactly enjoy them. But this time, he refused to go on any, and just sat near the exit waiting for us to get off. We were about to go into the Haunted Mansion when I decided that I would hold off and sit with Uncle Rick. I took a seat next to him, and we just sat there quietly for about half an hour. If you've ever been to Disney World, you know how long the lines can actually get. Finally, he muttered something to me. What? I was trying to direct my focus at him. I was told something bad would happen today. I could barely understand his quiet voice over the commotion around us. What? By who? I urgently remarked back at him. Something unholy. A tear rolled down his cheek. My heart dropped. This isn't my usual Uncle Rick talking. Uncle Rick was just sad, a miserable shell of himself. When my sister and my mom finally got off the ride, I remember looking up and seeing the joyful man staring down at me. I had been so genuinely sad, my Uncle Rick was so miserable that I had too been crying. Though I didn't notice until my mom shouted at me. Seriously? You two seriously gotta be kidding me. Do you know how much goddamn money I spent on this place? You can have a good time. That's when I realized that I was in the happiest place on earth, and I was still crying like a baby. I stood up and said, "You're right, Mom. Let's just go to Space Mountain. You coming, Uncle Rick?" I remember the look he gave me. It was a look of absolute sorrow, and I felt guilty as he It really looked as though he had to pry himself off the bench. On our way over to Space Mountain, we came across a Mickey Mouse mascot giving out autographs and taking photos of excited children. My sister, who was younger than I was, begged my mom to go get a picture of Mickey. My mom gave in and walked over. I kept looking over my shoulder to check on Uncle Rick, whose pace slowly slowed as we approached the mascot. My mom and sister stood in a line, eager to get a picture with the infamous Mickey. I, on the other hand, was still about 10 feet from them, waiting for Uncle Rick. I almost felt angry at my mom for not sympathizing with her own goddamn brother. I mean, fucking family's still family. Even though something was obviously seriously wrong with them, my mom absolutely just did not give a flying fuck. I stood there waiting for him when he finally caught up and I grabbed his hand to try to assist him over. But as our palms met, I noticed his hand was growing shockingly cold. I grasped as I jerked my hand slowly away, and I simply said, "Uncle Rick, are you okay?" He just stared at me. His face was different than I had ever seen it before. It didn't look like Uncle Rick at all. It looked like the epitome of misery, like a true Uncle Scrooge himself. I wanted to break down crying. I have never seen such a disturbing sight in my entire life. And not disturbing in a way that made me frightened, but disturbing in the way that affected me as a person, in a way that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget. I ran over to my mom and grabbed her arm and simply said, "We need to leave now." She gave me a puzzled look on her face. No, we don't. Your uncle, he's just... She stopped mid-sentence as she looked behind me with a shocked look on her face. I was hesitant to turn around by the look at her face. I knew what I was about to see, and it was going to be bad. I never could imagine how bad it was going to be. I finally convinced myself to turn around, and before me, I saw my Uncle Rick standing 15 feet away from me. I was looking at the Mickey mascot, and the Mickey mascot was looking at him. That's when I noticed Mickey's body was facing the opposite direction of Mickey's head. I couldn't understand why the mascot looked like that. And and it wouldn't be the, well, Disney employees. What did they have to put a stop to this? What's happening? That's when it happened. In an instant, the Mickey mascot let out a deafening sound that resembled 1,000 people screaming. I cupped my ears, trying to drown out the noise, but it was no use. Then, just as soon as the noise started, it stopped. When I looked up, Mickey was no more than 10 feet from my face. Its face was distorted. It had black eyes with small white pupils and huge rat-like teeth on the front, surrounded by what looked like hundreds of human teeth. Filling the gums of Mickey's mouth, the skin of the mascot was gray and the material looked aged and rotten. Then I heard it say in a voice that sounded like 1,000 people talking like once, "We are puppets. Nothing more than a test for what's to come." I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I could only watch, as in a blink of an eye, Mickey was standing in front of my Uncle Rick. The mascot's hand slowly lifted off of his body by some unseen force. I saw a reddish-black liquid pour out of the open neck and slit down the body of the mascot. My Uncle Rick started screaming like bloody murder. Then something happened. I'm not even sure what. I turned my head, I covered my ears in an attempt to shield myself to what was happening to my uncle. Then I woke up in a cold sweat on the concrete, screaming as my family and some Disney cast members crowded around me. I saw my Uncle Rick looking down at me with concern in his eyes. I jolted to my feet and grabbed my Uncle Rick's arm, and then I said, "Please, Uncle Rick, we need to fucking go!" He placed his hand on mine. It was warm again, and he told me with a smile on his face that everything was going to be okay and that I just fainted from the heat. No, I didn't faint. It took me a few seconds to come back to reality, and when I did, I hugged my Uncle Rick like I've never hugged him before. I sat down in a cast members only area to cool down, and even though I wasn't really that hot, they gave me some water and told me just to relax, that the paramedics would be here soon to ensure that I wouldn't pass out again. It was simply company policy. And I assured them that I was fine, mainly because I wanted to get the hell out of there, but my efforts felt useless. The paramedics arrived, and I was taken to the nearest emergency room. The nurse did some tests, and I talked to the doctor for a while. I was fine. Nothing was wrong with me. And I know that what I saw was real. I wouldn't have just imagined something like that. If I did nothing imagined, there's no way. I laid in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling for a good 2 hours. That's when it occurred to me. The place that they had me sit down after I supposedly fainted was one of the mascot exits or entries. I felt cold when I recalled seeing a reddish-black liquid puddle on the floor near the entrance, with a wet floor sign on it. That was the same liquid coming out of the costume. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and I was trying to convince myself that they were right, and somehow I did faint, and maybe I was just seeing something imaginary. But then, why the hell would there be liquid on the floor? I was starting to panic. My mom slowly walked into the room. Her cheeks were drenched in tears. Her hands were filled with tissue, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't know how, but I knew something had happened. She sat down in a chair next to mine and put her hand on mine, and she told me what happened. Every word felt like a knife sticking deeper and deeper into my heart. My throat started choking up, as it is now. My uncle had shot himself that night. He had a Bible clenched in his hand when he did it. He was dead. I knew why, but nobody else would. A happy, joyful, funny man like him does not just decide to blow his fucking brains out at one night. No, something happened to him. That mascot did something to him that I didn't see because I fucking looked away. I feel like if I hadn't looked away, and if I could have stared at him, but no, I can't. Now he's dead. I don't have anything to do with Disney anymore. When I moved out of my mom's house, I burned everything Disney I owned. I refuse to go back there. I don't know what I saw that day, and even though I can still feel it clear as day, I feel sick every time. I don't look for answers. I never did, and I don't want to know what it was. I think that it would be 1,000 times worse than remaining clueless. All I know is that it seems as if there's something other than a fun atmosphere or the job benefits that keeps people working at Disney. Maybe there's more to life in general, something we'll never understand until we're dead. Maybe I did faint, though maybe it was just a costume. Maybe It Was Just a Costume was a nice short story written by Hill Hank. It was a entertaining story, although I felt that it could use a little bit more writing and a little bit more build-up. Basically, there was jump scare, scream, and the story ended. Nothing more, nothing less. As for the story itself, I think that it was well written. The guy clearly understands sentence structure, and he wrote something that was serviceable. I won't say anything more, but yes, it was serviceable. It's not a creepypasta. It's not quite a true horror, but it was a little taste of what this author could possibly provide in the future. Hill Hank, if you happen to see my narration, understand that I did enjoy your story, although it could be improved in many ways. There needs to be build-up and actual tension for horror to be realized. You have the imagery down, you just don't have the tension. So, in future, I would love to see what you have to author. And if you would like to read other stories written by him, I have a link to his Wikia right down below. This has been your host, That Creepy Reading, reminding you that I do have a Patreon, and if you give me any amount of money, it would really help the show out a lot. I am working on moving out of my house, and I could really use any bit that you guys have to spare. If you can't do that by supporting the show financially, and hey, I get it, a lot of people have issues, especially during this time of year, you could always simply go and like and share or comment on the video. Really, any little bit of support you give helps. Even if you don't want to interact with this video and that's too much for you, you can always just click on one of these two videos on screen. It's more content, and the ad will give me a little bit more to deal with. So, yes, you can click on a top list here or a creepypasta there. It's up to you. And if you don't want to watch me, you can always just tell me I fucking suck. This has been your host, That Creepy Reading, and giving you a very depressed goodbye.